let's go right to the White House. Here is the president just moments ago with the Vice President Joe Biden standing by his side making the announcement.
Today,
and Chris, here is the president.
After 2 years of negotiations, the United States, together with our international partners, has achieved something that decades of animosity has not. A comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon. This deal demonstrates that American diplomacy can bring about real and meaningful change. Change that makes our country and the world safer and more secure. This deal is also in line with a tradition of American leadership. It's now more than 50 years since President Kennedy stood before the American people and said, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." He was speaking then about the need for discussions between the United States and the Soviet Union, which led to efforts to restrict the spread of nuclear weapons. In those days, the risk was a catastrophic nuclear war between two superpowers. In our time, the risk is that nuclear weapons will spread to more and more countries, particularly in the Middle East, the most volatile region in our world. Today, because America negotiated from a position of strength and principle, we have stopped the spread of nuclear weapons in this region. Because of this deal, the international community will be able to verify that the Islamic Republic of Iran will not develop a nuclear weapon. This deal meets every single one of the bottom lines that we established when we achieved a framework earlier this spring. Every pathway to a nuclear weapon is cut off, and the inspection and transparency regime necessary to verify that objective will be put in place. Because of this deal, Iran will not produce the highly enriched uranium and weapons-grade plutonium that form the raw materials necessary for a nuclear bomb. Because of this deal, Iran will remove 2/3 of its installed centrifuges, the machines necessary to produce highly enriched uranium for a bomb.
So we don't know all the details, but the president laying out quite a few of them right there. The most important statement I think we heard is that this will cut off every single path that Iran had to build a nuclear weapon, and that this carries out every single one of the principles that was adopted and established in April as the framework for a nuclear agreement. Igor Volsky, good or bad for the United States?
Well, we'll have to see. This is a 100-plus page deal. The details here are key. Certainly, they spent the additional hours making sure that everything here is up to snuff, that actually the translations between the English and the Persian were identical, so that Iran couldn't later come in and say, hey, we had some different understanding of some of these provisions. I think the key in what the president said, and we didn't take this, but he said it right after, is that this agreement isn't built on trust. It's built on verification. And if the international community, the IAEA, which will be inspecting a lot of these sites, if they can verify over time that Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapon, then of course in 5-10 years, this will, I think, in the rearview mirror seem like a historic achievement. But I think today, the details of the agreement, the way it's implemented, let's wait and see how those two layers go through before I think celebrating.
I'm ready to celebrate.
It's because we have that vodka here, Bill. I know what you're after.
But the reason I say that is because, first of all, we should always maintain our skepticism about anything the government does, right? And there are 100 different ways this deal could fall apart. But at the same time, I think the president has achieved an historic agreement here, meaning that there were those that thought we had to bomb Iran. Netanyahu didn't want us to make this deal. Saudi Arabia didn't want us to make this deal. John McCain, George Bush, Dick Cheney. And President Obama said, no, I think there's a possibility of getting a diplomatic solution. Whoever thought a couple of years ago that we'd be, number one, sitting at the same table with Iran, and number two, actually achieving a deal whereby Iran would say, at least for 10 years, we're going to stop building a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, President Bush tried to at the very end of his term and failed. The fact, though, and you're right here, that we are close to solving or may have solved a key security issue facing the world without a single shot being fired, I think is very significant.
Right. And it does, kind of respond to the president's detractors, that and I've been critical of him for not taking bolder action on several fronts. He's got his own way of doing things, and he does get things done.
And in this case, certainly slow and steady.
In his own way. Right, slow and steady. And I think it's important to point out, too, that at the table with us, right, it's not just the United States, which is why I'm maybe more confident than you that this is a good deal, because at the table with us are China, Russia, the UK, France, and Germany, right? The so-called P5+1, we're the one. It would be hard to believe that Iran snookered every one of them.
Very true. And, it's that international community, the international pressure that first brought Iran to the table with the international sanctions regime that was put in place. And now there's international support for moving in a different direction, saying years of sanctions have failed to prevent Iran from pursuing a nuclear weapon. They have more nuclear materials now than they did in the beginning of the sanctions regime. And that's a key question for detractors of this deal, who will hear in the minutes, hours, days, and weeks to come, is what's your alternative? Because this idea of global sanctions preventing Iran from going down the nuclear path has failed. Here the world is saying is an alternative to that. And if you don't have any other kind of solution other than saying this is a bad deal, then really you can't be taken seriously.
Right. And it's got to be put in the historical context, too. I mean, we have been basically not at war, but we have had no relations, zero relations with Iran since 1979, 1980, the end of the Carter administration, when they seized American hostages. And ever since then, we've been the great Satan to them, and they have been kind of no man's land to us. So this really ends like 35, 40 years.
Well, and the hope here, now that you've settled the nuclear issue, maybe you can delve into some of these other issues that we have and work in areas of cooperation in the region, because Iran is certainly becoming a serious security force in the Middle East, and they need to cooperate with America.